"What would you do with $1 billion?" he asked, not looking up from his watch as if time itself answered to him. And the table laughed on cue, glasses clinking, voices overlapping, a rhythm of wealth that filled the room without asking permission. But she didn't laugh. Clara Whitmore stood there with a notepad in her hand, still, composed, as if the question had been placed gently in front of her instead of thrown like a coin across a polished table. The restaurant hummed around them, low jazz drifting through the air, the soft glow of amber lights reflecting off crystal and silver. And yet something shifted, something subtle. The moment her silence lasted 1 second longer than expected, Ethan Caldwell finally looked up, just a glance at first, the kind he gave employees, strangers, people who existed in the margins of his day. But there was something in her expression that didn't fit, not defiance, not fear, just a quiet presence that refused to bend to the weight of his. To please him, Clara reached for the bill holder tucked under her arm, opened it, and instead of speaking, she picked up a pen, the small motion almost invisible against the backdrop of laughter and clinking glasses. She wrote something down, slowly, carefully, as if the act itself mattered more than the speed. Ethan frowned slightly, his curiosity sharpening. The room seemed to lean in without realizing it, conversation softening, attention shifting in subtle waves toward the quiet center. Forming at that table, she closed the bill holder and placed it in front of him, not pushing it, not presenting it with flourish, just setting it there like a fact that didn't need explanation. "Your total, sir," she said softly, her voice even, professional, but there was something beneath it, something that didn't match the expected script. Ethan didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he looked at her, searching for the joke, the hesitation, the sign that she had missed the point. But there was none, just that same calm presence, unshaken. He let out a small breath, almost a laugh, and flipped the holder open, expecting a number, a receipt, something ordinary. But instead he saw a single line written in clean, precise handwriting, no dollar amount, no breakdown, just words, simple and direct. And for the first time that evening, the man who controlled boardrooms and billion-dollar deals didn't speak, because in that moment, the question he had thrown so casually into the air no longer belonged to her. It had found its way back to him, heavier than before, and the silence that followed wasn't empty at all. It was filled with something unfamiliar, something he couldn't buy, couldn't rush, couldn't dismiss. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell sat perfectly still, staring at a single sentence that refused to move out of his mind. The room did not return to normal right away. The laughter that had filled the space only moments ago faded into something quieter, more cautious, as if everyone sensed that a line had been crossed without anyone seeing exactly when it happened. Ethan kept his eyes on the bill holder, reading the sentence again, slower this time, letting each word settle, not because he did not understand it, but because he understood it too well. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, still, controlled. Yet there was a tension there now, subtle but undeniable, the kind that appeared when certainty began to slip. One of his colleagues cleared his throat, attempting to break the silence with a casual chuckle. "So what did she write, Ethan?" he asked, leaning slightly forward, trying to reclaim the moment, to turn it back into something light, something harmless. But Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed the bill holder with deliberate care, as if he were placing something fragile, out of sight. And then he looked up at Clara again, really looked this time, not at her uniform, not at the role she played in the room, but at her. "Explain it," he said, his voice lower now, not commanding, not mocking, just direct. Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. As if this was simply another table, another customer, another quiet exchange in a long evening. "It is already clear," she replied gently, her tone respectful but firm. And that answer, more than anything, shifted something in him. Because he was not used to being denied explanation. He was not used to someone trusting him to understand without guidance. He leaned back slightly, studying her, searching for any sign of arrogance, of defiance, of performance. But there was none, only composure, only a quiet certainty that did not need to prove itself. Around them, the restaurant resumed its rhythm, waiters moving between tables, soft conversations returning, But at that table, time seemed to move differently, slower, heavier. Ethan reached for his glass but did not drink, his thoughts moving in ways they had not in years. Numbers, strategies, projections. Those were easy. Those were systems he controlled. But this was different. This was not about what something cost. It was about what something meant. And meaning could not be calculated on a spreadsheet. "You think I asked the wrong question," he said finally. Not as an accusation, but as a realization forming out loud. Clara tilted her head slightly, considering. "I think," she said, pausing just enough to let the words find their place, "that some questions sound simple because we do not hear what they reveal." Ethan exhaled slowly, a faint smile touching his lips, not amused, not dismissive, just thoughtful, the kind of expression that rarely appeared in rooms like this. One of his friends shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them, sensing that the dynamic had changed in a way he could not quite define. Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out his card, placing it on the table, not sliding it toward her, not offering it as leverage, just setting it down. "Stay for a minute," he said, his tone measured, almost careful. Clara glanced toward the other tables she was responsible for, then back at him, weighing the request, not the man, and after a brief moment, she gave a small nod, not as compliance, but as a choice. She stepped slightly closer, not sitting, not lowering herself into the space, simply standing there with the same quiet presence. Ethan tapped the closed bill holder lightly with his finger. "Most people would have answered with numbers," he said. "Investments, charities, something impressive." Clara's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Most people think the question is about money," she replied, and there it was. Again, that shift, that subtle redirection that did not confront but revealed. Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but softer. "And it is not," he said, more to himself than to her. Clara shook her head slightly. "It is about readiness," she said, her voice steady. "About whether someone understands what they are holding before they decide what to do with it." Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to his watch, the polished face reflecting the warm light above, a symbol he had worn for years. Without thinking, and for the first time, it felt like more than an object. It felt like a question he had never asked himself. He looked back up at her, and the room, the noise, the expectations, all of it seemed a little less certain than before, not because he had lost anything, but because something new had entered the space, something that did not belong to his world of control, and for once, he did not try to take control of it. He simply sat there, listening. For a moment neither of them moved, the space between them holding something unspoken, something that did not need to be filled with more words. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when a person realizes the conversation is no longer on familiar ground. He glanced around. The restaurant, noticing details he had ignored earlier, the way a couple in the corner leaned toward each other, speaking softly, the way another server adjusted a table setting with quiet precision, the way the entire room functioned without announcing itself. And then his attention returned to Clara, who still stood there, calm, composed, unaffected by the shift that had unsettled him. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. The question simple, but the tone different now, no longer probing for weakness, but searching for context. Clara considered the question briefly. "Long enough to know most people do not really see where they are," she replied. And again, her answer did not follow the expected path. Ethan's lips pressed together in a faint, thoughtful line. "And you see them?" he said, not quite a question. Clara shook her head slightly. "I notice patterns," she said. "What people say when they are comfortable, what they ask when they are not." Ethan let out a quiet breath, leaning forward just enough to rest his forearms on the table, a posture he rarely took in business meetings, one that suggested he was no longer performing. One of his colleagues checked his phone, clearly disengaging, the energy at the table no longer matching what he had come for. But Ethan remained focused. "And what did my question say?" he asked, his voice steady. Clara's gaze did not waver. "It said you are used to having answers ready before the question is finished," she said, "and that you expect the same from everyone else." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in irritation, but in recognition. "That is not unreasonable," he replied, almost reflexively. Clara nodded once, acknowledging the logic. "It is not," she said, but it is incomplete. The word lingered, soft but precise. Ethan leaned back again, absorbing it. Incomplete. Not wrong. Not foolish. Just missing something. And that distinction mattered more than he expected. He picked up his glass this time, and took a small sip, the motion giving him a moment to think, to recalibrate, something he had built his entire career on. Yet this felt different, because there was no deal to close, no advantage to secure, only understanding to reach. So what would you do? He asked again. But this time the question had changed, the tone stripped of performance, stripped of expectation. Clara looked at him for a long second, as if weighing whether the question had truly shifted or if it was simply repeating itself in a different form. Then she spoke, her voice quiet, steady. I would wait, she said. Ethan blinked once, the answer landing differently than before, not because it was surprising, but because it was deliberate. Wait for what? He asked. Clara glanced briefly at the room around them, then back at him. Until I understood why I was given it, she said, and what it would ask of me in return. Ethan felt something settle in that moment. Not an answer, not a conclusion, but a realization that the conversation had moved beyond the original question entirely. This was no longer about money, not even about decisions. It was about responsibility, about awareness, about the unseen weight behind visible success. He tapped his fingers lightly against the table, a habit he had when processing new information. But the rhythm was slower now, less controlled, more reflective. Most people would take it immediately, he said, almost to himself. Clara gave a small, knowing nod. Most people already have, she replied, and that line lingered, heavier than the others, because it did not just point outward, it pointed inward. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly, then lifted again, meeting hers with a different kind of focus, one that did not seek to measure or judge, but to understand. And for the first time that evening, the power at the table did not come from wealth or status or control. It came from clarity, quiet, steady, undeniable, and it did not belong to him. The weight of her last words did not fade. It settled, quiet but persistent, like something that refused to be ignored once it had been noticed. Ethan sat there with his hands resting loosely on the table, no longer tapping, no longer reaching for anything, just still, as if movement itself might break the fragile clarity forming in his mind. Across from him, one of his colleagues shifted in his seat, forcing a light tone back into the space. Come on, Ethan, it is just a philosophical answer, he said with a half laugh. If someone handed me $1 billion, I would not wait. I would invest it by morning. A few others nodded, eager to return to familiar ground, to numbers, to action, to certainty. Ethan did not respond to them. His gaze remained on Clara, because what she had said did not feel philosophical. It felt practical in a way that made everything else seem rushed, incomplete. He leaned slightly forward again, lowering his voice just enough to separate the conversation from the noise around them. You think taking it too quickly is the mistake, he said. Clara did not answer right away. She picked up the empty water glass from the table, turning it slightly in her hand, as if considering something beyond the object itself. Then she set it back down exactly where it had been, aligned, precise. I think people confuse access with ownership, she said. Ethan's brow furrowed, the distinction landing but not fully settling yet. Explain that, he said quietly, and this time there was no resistance in his tone, only curiosity. Clara met his gaze, steady as before. Just because something is placed in your hands does not mean it belongs to you, she said. It means you are responsible for what happens next. The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that did not rely on volume to be heard. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back, his eyes drifting briefly to the large windows lining the restaurant. The city lights beyond them steady and distant, a skyline built on decisions, on risks, on timing. And for the first time he wondered how many of those decisions had been made too quickly, not out of confidence, but out of habit. He turned back to her, something quieter in his expression now, less guarded. And waiting changes that, he said. Clara nodded once. Waiting forces you to see what you are holding, she replied, and what it might cost you to keep it. One of the men at the table let out a soft scoff, shaking his head. Cost, he repeated. With that kind of money, there is no cost. Ethan's eyes flickered toward him for a brief second, not in agreement, not in dismissal, just acknowledgement. Then back to Clara, because the answer he was looking for was not coming from anyone else. Clara's gaze softened slightly, not in emotion, but in understanding. There is always a cost, she said. Sometimes it is not measured in dollars. The table fell quieter again, not because they all agreed, but because they could not immediately argue with it. Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward his watch again. She replied, her tone unchanged, steady, professional, yet not distant. You said something earlier, he continued, about understanding what you are holding before deciding what to do with it. Clara nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. Most people would call that hesitation, he said, or even fear. Clara picked up a folded napkin from the table, smoothing it gently between her fingers before placing it back down, her movements precise, unhurried. Only if they believe speed proves control, she said. Ethan considered that, his gaze drifting briefly to the glass in front of him, untouched now, the condensation forming a thin ring on the table, a detail he would have ignored before, but now it felt like part of a larger pattern, small things revealing themselves when he stopped rushing past them. And you do not believe that, he said. Clara met his eyes again. I believe control is knowing when not to act, she replied, the words simple, but grounded, as if they came from experience rather than theory. Ethan leaned back, letting that settle, because it challenged something fundamental, something he had built his identity around, the idea that action, fast and decisive, was always the answer. Yet here she was, standing in a place where speed was expected, where efficiency was everything, and still choosing to move differently, to think differently. One of the men at the table checked his watch and stood up, muttering something about an early meeting. Another followed, the group slowly dissolving without ceremony, their attention no longer anchored to the moment. Ethan barely noticed them leave. His focus remained where it had shifted, steady, intentional. Where did you learn that? He asked, not as a challenge, but as genuine curiosity. Clara's expression did not change, but there was a pause this time, slightly longer than before, not hesitation, but selection, choosing what to reveal and what to leave unspoken. From watching what happens when people do not wait, she said. Ethan studied her, sensing that there was more behind that answer, but also understanding, for the first time, that not everything needed to be explained to be true. He nodded slowly, accepting it without pushing further, because the conversation was no longer about extracting information. It was about recognizing perspective. He reached into his wallet, pulling out his card again, placing it neatly beside the bill holder. Then, after a brief moment, he added something else, a small stack of cash, not excessive, not performative, just enough, measured, intentional. Clara glanced at it, then back at him, her expression unchanged. This is more than necessary, she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. It is not for the service, he replied, his voice calm. It is for the answer. Clara's eyes held his for a moment longer, and in that moment, there was no imbalance, no hierarchy, just two people acknowledging something real, something earned without transaction. She reached forward, not to take the money immediately, but to adjust the bill holder, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small gesture, but precise, deliberate, as if reminding him that value was not in what was given, but in how it was understood. Then make sure you remember it, she said softly. Ethan gave a faint nod, not as agreement, but as acceptance, because for once, he knew that remembering would not be automatic. It would require the same thing she had spoken about from the beginning, attention, patience, and the willingness to sit with something longer than was comfortable. And as she stepped away to return to her other tables, the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt defined, shaped by a conversation that had not raised its voice, yet had changed something that no amount of money ever had. The table was empty now, the hum of conversation around him returning to its usual rhythm, but it no longer felt the same. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, his hand resting near the bill holder, not touching it, just aware of its presence, as if it had become something more than paper and ink. He glanced toward the direction Clara had gone, watching as she moved between tables with the same quiet precision, the same unhurried focus. Nothing about her had changed, and yet everything about how he saw her had. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket out of habit, but the motion lacked its usual sharpness. As if even that small act had softened, he picked up the bill holder and his card, pausing for a second before placing them back down exactly where they had been, aligned, intentional, mirroring the way she had done it, not out of imitation, but out of understanding. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. Each step, measured, not rushed. The city air greeted him as he stepped outside, cool, steady, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and life moving forward without pause. His driver opened the door of the car, waiting as always, but Ethan did not get in right away. He stood there, looking out at the street, the lights stretching into the distance, people passing by with their own destinations, their own questions, their own unseen waits. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone, unlocking it. The screen lighting up with notifications, messages, numbers, opportunities, the language he understood best, and yet for the first time, it felt incomplete. He locked the screen again without responding, slipping it back into his pocket. The driver glanced at him briefly, uncertain. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked. Ethan nodded once. "Yes," he said. But the word carried a different meaning now, not confirmation, but awareness. He finally stepped into the car, the door closing softly behind him. The interior quiet, controlled, familiar, the engine starting with a low hum as they pulled away from the curb, the city moving past the window in a blur of light and motion. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused, not on the buildings, not on the traffic, but somewhere in between, replaying the conversation, not the words themselves, but the pauses, the silence, the way each answer had not filled the space, but expanded it. He glanced at his watch again, the polished surface, reflecting his own face back at him, composed, successful, unchanged on the outside, but something beneath that had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. He lifted his wrist slightly, studying it as if seeing it for the first time, then let it fall back to his side. The driver spoke again after a moment. "Office or home, sir?" Ethan hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because for once, the choice did not feel automatic. He looked out the window again, the city still moving, still asking nothing, still offering everything. "Home," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. The car changed direction smoothly, merging into the flow of traffic, and as the distance between him and the restaurant grew, the conversation did not fade. It stayed with him, not as a memory, but as a question that had not been answered, and for the first time, he did not